We hope that breakout experience was useful and beneficial and understandable to you. If you're hearing this right now and seeing this video screen, then you know that you've made your way back. And we're really glad to have you. We think that this technology is going to be helpful, a way to take people from a large experience with more than 70 of us here and putting people into smaller groups. So there's a little technology that makes that a little cumbersome, but we think it's a pretty good option. I want to just let you know that over in the chat room, you're going to see a link for a giveaway from one of the partners in Reimagining Theological Education called The Hatchery. The Hatchery is doing some great work. They've organized their experiences around a person developing patterns of how to live, how to learn, and then how to launch. So a lot more you can hear about what the Hatchery is up to, including a giveaway, a big 24-book giveaway. They have partnered with a number of presenters and publishers and have more than $742 worth of books to give away to one lucky winner. So you click on that link, you'll find out about the Hatchery. You also sign up for the giveaway, and you just might be a person that wins $742 worth of books, which then you have to find some place to put all those books unless they come to you in a digital format, which could be a whole other problem. But we hope that some of you have a chance to win that. The Hatchery over in LA, training people from around the world in living, learning, and launching a new expression of theological education. Do we have Brian back with us yet? Has he beamed himself up? Because if not, we are going to run his video because we have him one way or the other. So Brian McLaren, who you met earlier if you've been a part of the webinar, of the online conference. Now, pardon me, I'm just going to take a moment to correct myself so that we all get corrected. This is not a webinar. This has surpassed webinar-ness. This is an online summit. This is a conference of grand scale where people have summited together to be at this mountaintop of online connection. In your breakout groups, any of you had a good experience, and what we'd like to do is to hear from you if what you experienced in your breakout group you'd like to share with the rest of us. Now, here's how you do that. Inside that, down on the lower part of your screen, you should see a couple of things. You should see a place where you can ask a question, the Q&A portion, and you also see a place where you could raise your hand. That little indicator where you can raise your hand, that'll indicate to Jeremy, who then will be able to say now, Jeremy, you've got a couple things to do at this point because that audio is not working. But we'd like to hear from you if you had something worth sharing with the rest of us. So what's going to happen if you raise your hand and Jeremy clicks on you is it's going to turn you into a presenter, which means your video is going to come on and your audio is going to come on, and we'd like to hear a reflection back from you. So is that good, Jeremy? Can we go both those directions? So if you experience something in your breakout group that you'd like to share with the rest of us, a reflection or an idea, we would love to hear from you. So click on the little button that lets you indicate that you have something to say, or if you don't see the raise your hand button for some reason, you can send it as a question or you could send it as a chat in the chat room.
I see Sherry, so we're going to go with Sherry first.
Okay. Hi, Sherry. I think you're going to... Sherry, I don't know if you know Star Trek, but to me, this just feels so much like in those old Star Trek episodes when someone would beam into the transporter room, and now all of a sudden there you are on the screen. So, hi, Sherry. What was your experience inside of your breakout room?
Well, we had a great little group of 5 of us, and talked about different things that Alexis and Will talked about, things that they were doing, and some of the topics that came up had to do with connecting, how to connect and inspire lay people to go deeper, and that might have deeper questions. We also talked about, Will mentioned that he had been part of an internship program called Life Together in the Boston area, and also mentioned something called Underground Seminary. So then that brought up the topic of how do we share best practices, things that are already working well that people are doing. So how can those kind of rise to the top and be shared for everyone? And then I had also just mentioned about, I think, trying to more intentionally bridge the chasm between what happens in the academy and what's happening or what people are aware of at the level of the pew. So just even introducing people to the fact that there is scholarship out there that you might be interested in learning about that typically isn't talked about from the pulpit.
Thank you, Sherry. That really brings up an interesting notion that for a lot of people, the whole point of theological education was to move someone from being a lay person to being a set-apart clergy. And it seems like some of the conversation in your group was to do something different with theological education with lay people, which is not to make them into a different category, but to equip them where they are.
Right.
Yeah. Sherry, where do you do what you do in the world? Where do you live and what do you do?
I'm a doctoral student at Claremont School of Theology, so I'm writing my dissertation and trying to get finished and out of here. So,
well, all the best to you in that.
Thank you.
All right. Let's see. So next we have Barbara.
So Barbara, we're going to transport you in. Sherry, we're probably going to move you out, so don't be surprised if you disappear. Hi, Barbara. Barbara, you're still muted, so just give us a second. We're going to unmute you. There you go.
I'm Barbara Blodgett. In our small group, we talked about two kinds of education that are needed today, focused on training for pastors, especially in churches that need to move from A to B and need to learn the practical skills of leading change. And secondly, we talked about education around environmental ministry. And the thing that emerged common to both of those is that both of those kinds of education are best taught by people who are well experienced in experiential teaching. However, the irony is that often those who are good at that kind of teaching are precisely the kind of people who don't have the credentials of the academy. So how to lift up their skills, discover them, find them, and utilize them. And then we also talked a little bit about credentialing and how credentialing processes are often very lengthy, and that if credentialing could be broken up and into these bits or bytes or badges or whatever the term these days is, that might help, say, a program that wants credentialing in some particular aspect of environmental ministry.
Great, thank you. Barbara, where do you do the good things that you do in the world?
Lexington Theological Seminary, an online seminary.
An online seminary. And are you training in the kinds of people in the way that you're describing now? Is that happening for you all there?
I like to think we are, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And were you one of the people who started that, who initiated that into being?
No, I wasn't there for the transformation, but joined after it had happened.
Yeah. Anything that you've learned in your time there that you were most encouraged and a bit surprised by? Something that is new to you now that you're doing this work?
I have been pleasantly surprised by the quality and level of conversation that one can have in a written discussion board. It's not the same as what we're doing now, but in some ways, even more voices can be heard. And I didn't think I would like it, and I do.
Excellent. Well, good. Thanks for your good work. Okay.
I wonder if you had a conversation recently with Brian where you talked about two things. So one are some insights from systems theory that I think you gleaned that might lend some interesting discussion to the idea of building a network that's built on a sort of trade association model.
Yeah, we had some interesting conversations with around the thoughts of someone who's thought a lot about network theory named Margaret Wheatley. Margaret Wheatley is someone who thinks about this for businesses and for education, for a variety of engagements. And Margaret's notion is that what gets created in a network is that you take people who are doing interesting practices and you find the people who are doing the very best of those practices and you connect them with one another. And that's often what we think about when we think about a network, right? Is that you're like, oh, I know some other people that are doing some interesting work. And for a lot of us, that's where the network stops is, oh, who do I know that's in my personal network? This word networking tends to have that kind of feel to it. But then Margaret says that above that, the best practices start to create a suprastructure that begins to support the creation of best practices. Because many best practices, practices. Like I would suggest, even if we'd heard a little bit more from Barbara about what they're creating in that online seminary, is there's a lot of innovators and people who have the ability to create from nothing. They don't need a lot of help or support. They have the competencies. They're just somehow they bring something to the situation that allows them to invent something new. Then they find other people invent something new, and they sort of look at each other and they say, hey, we've all invented something new. This is really interesting. And so if all you want to do is to connect people who have that innate ability to create something, then that's a really powerful network and very meaningful to people in their life and their experience. But if you want to expand that more greatly, and this is what Eric was getting at in the illustration of the network of brewers, the Brewers Association is a bit of a supra network, right? It's something larger than the personal relationships between the brewers. In fact, I would imagine that if you went back and asked the people that did the brewing from 1980, you know, when there were down to 40 brewers over the last 25 years, 30 years, that people could tell you the friendship networks they had. They had the phone numbers of everybody else who was doing this interesting networking. But the way it went from 40 back up to 4,000 wasn't just through a personal network. It was through a larger supra network that then started to create the possibility of best practices being shared across the system. So a lot of us have realized that in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, some of the network we've been doing in theological education and Christianity as a whole has reach the critical level where there's so many good things going on that no one group or one person or one set of relationships can hold all of that. So that's the need for this larger supra network. And that's one of the things that the Reimagining Theological Education sees itself doing, as far as I understand it, and I think it's very exciting, is to create this larger set of connections so that those best practices can be shared with one another, but then also shared much more broadly.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And we do have Brian back now. Brian, we're having a little trouble with the recording that we had of that we recorded for your video. And I'm wondering if we can't get that going, if you're able to do a version of that presentation for us in the live presenter model.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Jeremy, by any chance, can you put those slides up, or is that not?
Sure, yeah, let me pull that up.
Probably that'd be a good way to do it. And then let me just say, as Jeremy pulls that up, I think one of our great challenges is we're very well skilled in the practices of analysis, which involves taking, as Doug said, a problem and then breaking the problem down into its component parts. But what happens when the problem is actually larger than the entity? So if the problem in seminary education is only in one component of seminary education, then we can break it down and solve the problem. What if there's a bigger system involved that we're dealing with? And that requires some of the skills of systems thinking. The example, I don't know, Jeremy, what do you think? Will we get those slides? Or
yeah, here we go.
Great. So you look at the frog and you think, okay, I want to understand the frog. You can go to the next slide, and you look at all the parts. That's really gross. Go to the next slide. But then you can ask the question, but the thing we're looking at is part of a larger ecosystem. And in fact, you can go to the next slide. That's part of an even larger ecosystem. And I think something similar could be going on when we look at struggles in the church and in seminary education, that there's larger things going on. Next slide. And you think of all the different things that could affect the life of that frog, an oil well 1,000 miles away, a house being built 10 miles away. You realize how all of this is so interconnected. Next slide. And in seminaries, I think we have a similar project going on. Jeremy, this will be my hand sign to you, okay? And so you think about seminaries, both the individual seminary, then things like the association, AETS and other associations, professional associations, and then denominational structures. But those structures are part of a much larger system. And if you think of it like this, there's local congregation, there's denominations, there's Christian publishing, there's Christian periodicals, there's Christian radio, Christian television, which in some ways for a lot of people is more powerful than the Vatican or whatever. There's the publishers of Christian music and hymnals, there's pension funds, there's Sunday school curricula, there's parachurch organizations, there's mission agencies, and all of these are part of this larger religious system. And one of the things we know in systems thinking is that if you try for any one part of the system to bring change, the other parts of the system will want to bring it back into equilibrium. In other words, if one part of the system tries to bring change, the other parts gang up on it and make the change even more difficult. If you want to bring change in any component, you have to bring change in the system as a whole simultaneously. If you go to the next slide. And so that's this larger system of the Christian community in North America. And of course, we could even go to larger systems than that. The whole system, if you go to the next slide, please, of the higher education, which is going through big changes, and organized religion, and then the world of spirituality and well-being. So for example, the proliferation of yoga studios is not unrelated to struggles that we see going on in Christian higher education, or into some of these innovative new things that are happening in theological education. You think about how all these are related to economic issues. Next slide. And how all of these are really ultimately then connected to things going on all around the world. Next slide, please. And so, as Doug mentioned earlier, part of our challenge is we have to realize that people are often being paid only to think about one part of this larger system. And if people are only being paid to think about one part of the problem, and that's all they do, you can pretty much guarantee we will never deal with the bigger systemic challenges that we face. Next slide. And so you might say then that in reimagining theological education, we're in three different lines of business. We're trying to support sustainable churches, we're trying to save unsustainable churches, and then we're trying to create the churches of the future. I should add there's a fourth, and that's the important work of the academic side of religious scholarship. Very, very important, but if we're especially thinking about the part of this that's related to church life, we've got those three there. Next slide. And so in a sense, we're not just reimagining existing theological education, but three very different theological education projects. Next slide, please. And I think we can see how people could look at these competitively. For example, there's been a lot of funding for the first of those three. But you think about how important that third category is. There's been very, very little funding for people saying, what kind of leaders will help invent these new churches of the future? If you want to say this is the craft breweries in this situation. And boy, how are we going to reapportion resources among these different projects? And how are we going to share best practices and good ideas among these projects? Next slide. And I personally have a special interest in that third category. But of course, we have to even there ask, what do we mean by innovative new churches for the future? But all three of these are very, very important. Next slide. Or is that the last one? Okay. And so in this way, we start talking about not just reimagining, but actually trying to imagine for the first time things that are unfamiliar to us. I just for example, as I think about this, I think some of these inventive churches for the future, I think they will be institutional in the sense that anything that lasts for more than a generation is institutional. I think we actually need things that last for more than a generation, because the spiritual formation of children, it turns out, is one of the most important things that happens, and one of the things that's gotten the least attention. In fact, probably an awful lot of people get an MDiv, and pay almost no attention to the formation of children. That's just pushed off to the side as somebody else's job. I think these things will have to be organized because they're going to be organizing together to get work done. I think our liturgies may be very different, but there will be liturgical elements. They'll be interested in theological engagement and scholarship, perhaps as past lay people weren't before. I think everyone's going to be interested in more academic theology. They're going to have to actually have an impact on people's spiritual lives. They've got to be financially sustainable or they don't work. And there's going to have to be flexibility for the purpose of mission. Well, that's a different leadership, a different set of leadership skills. And what is it going to take to, in a sense, create a whole new line of work that we're doing for those people? That's a place where you see the need to share best practices.
Brian, that's excellent. Thank you. And nice recovery from the video problem. Excellent. Well done. That's the kind of structural flexibility you're talking about. All right. We're going to ask you to go into your breakout rooms again and talk with each other about this. Now we've got the rhythm down, right? You're going to go out, you're going to leave this building, you're going to go into your breakout room. You're going to talk about this, and maybe this would be a helpful frame for you. Brian suggested these 3 types of churches and a 4th category of academic pursuit. Sustainable churches, the ones that should be around. What do we do to save unsustainable churches or not? And then what do we do about churches of the future? If you're thinking about spirituality and the development of spirituality and formation in people in collective ways, those are 3 pretty interesting categories: sustainable churches, unsustainable churches, and then ones that don't exist yet that will exist for the future. And then also the interaction of the academic institutions and the academic community of theological education. So maybe you'll talk about, in your breakout groups, of those, where do you find yourself starting? Which of these 3 do you find yourself in? And then, perhaps even more importantly, what do you think that perspective or that location or that circumstance you find yourself in allows you to contribute back into the network? So where do you find yourself in those 4 categories, if those are helpful to you? And then what do you bring into this network to do those last bits of work of how do we create a new way of being? So Jeremy's going to post again in the chat room the link. So use that link, and if you haven't opened that chat room down below, go to that chat bubble window and click on that zoom.us/55473 number, and that will take you into a series of chat rooms where you will again be put in the chat rooms. And if you do the same thing that Sherry and Barbara did, which is suggest that some people in your room might give us some reflection when you come back, we'll put you for 15 minutes into a conversation there. And then we're going to come back and have some reflections from our panelists and from the breakout rooms. So thanks, everybody. So go ahead and click down there. We can start to see. I'm just going to talk for a bit because I can see the number of people who are leaving this room that we're in. I'd say it works pretty well this way. It's like if you're at a conference and you say to yourself, hey, you guys aren't over in that chat room yet. The strange thing is you're not physically moving anywhere, but you are relationally moving somewhere else, which is in and of itself is an interesting commentary on what's happening in how people are trained, interact, and share their lives with one another. So we're really glad to be doing this interaction in this internet supported way, in addition to the physical kinds of conferences that we find ourselves in. So that's just a little commentary for the 13 of you that are still in this room with me. We're glad to have you here. And again, I get it that some of you might not be able to leave. That might be a thing you can't do, or you don't want to. Maybe you're saying to yourself, hey, I don't want to go into that room over there. I want to stay right where I am right now. And that's totally fine as well. If you'd rather just stay here, but if you're having trouble knowing what to do, or if you just walked away from your computer and have now come back, or and you were saying, where is everybody? Well, everybody is in the breakout rooms, and you get there by clicking on the chat bubble down at the bottom of your screen, and that will pull up a link from Jeremy. If you scroll, you may have to scroll down, and then you click on that link that ends in 3403, and that will then randomly assign you